Alrighty, so the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to hit Shift A, search for your mesh, and grab your icosphere. Make sure it has 5 subdivisions and shade it smooth. Then you want to go to your camera and select it. Then you're going to want to switch the focal length to something like a 100 or a 102 so that it's nice and centered around your sphere. Next, for the lighting, you can just go ahead and go to rendered preview. We're going to go to this drop down and turn off scene world, and then we will select an outdoor foresty HDRI that's already built into Blender. So now we have our lighting and our camera set up. And if you're wondering, we're going to be working through the tutorial in Eevee. Then at the end, I'll be showing you the different cycle settings that can make the good looking material. I mean, the Eevee one still looks decent if it's going for like a game texture or something, but the cycles one is the one that's really popping. But we're going to be working through Eevee because it runs faster, and then at the end, we'll switch to cycles to see what it looks like. Secondly, we're going to head over to the shading workspace. We're going to make sure we go to the render preview again and make sure we have our correct HDRI selected, the forest one, and we'll go to camera view. Then we'll make sure we are in object mode on our shading tab. Next, we're going to be hitting our icosphere selected. We'll press new, and then we'll call it Cobblestone. Actually, I think it's just one word, Cobblestone. There we go. And then to get started, we'll hit Shift A, and we'll be searching for a Voronoi texture. Then we'll go to Edit Preferences and make sure we have the Node Wrangler add-on installed. Just type in Node Wrangler, and then you just check it and you're good. So with this selected, we're going to hit Control T. Then we're going to use this texture coordinate, and we're going to move the object into the vector of the mapping. And if we Control Shift and left click on the Voronoi texture, we can see that this is what's happening here. On this texture, we're going to switch from F1 to distance to edge so that we get sort of a rocky pattern. Next, we'll be hitting Shift A and search for a color ramp. And what we're doing right now is we're making the mask of where the rocks in the cobblestone will be. So right here, we're going to be dragging in this white quite a bit, all the way to 0.03-ish. So really quite a lot. I use this 0.032. So that is what we'll be using here. And so this is just our mask, basically our general mask. The next step is we're going to be adding in some flavor to the mask so that it's not so one-dimensional, which is black and white. So we'll be adding another Voronoi texture. We will be leaving the scale also at a 5 and the randomness at a 1 and switching to distance to edge. So basically it's the same Voronoi texture. We could use the same one, but I'll use a different one just for the sake of the tutorial. So now that we have this, we're going to hit Shift A and search for another color ramp. And this is where these two textures are going to differ. We're going to be switching this black over here, and we're going to be switching it all the way to a 0.1 instead of a 0 on the value scale, like this. And this white, we're going to be switching it from a 1 to a 0.8. And if we Control Shift and left click to preview this, it's adding more of a blur effect so that the mask is more gradually getting higher towards the center of the rocks, which is sort of what we want. The next thing we're going to do is we'll hit Shift A, and we'll add a noise texture. Not a white noise texture, just a normal noise texture. There we are. And we're going to move this back a little bit, and then we'll move this vector into the noise texture like this. Now, on the noise texture, we're going to be switching the scale to a 5.2. Oops, I don't know how I did that. A 5.2, the detail to a 16, the roughness to a 0.6, and the distortion we will leave alone. And if we Control Shift left click to preview this noise texture, we can see what's going on here. Then we'll Shift A, add a color ramp, move the factor from the noise texture into the color ramp, and Control Shift left click to preview this color ramp. Next, we will be taking the color and moving the black to close to a 0.4. That's good enough. That's a good enough contrast, but it's a little bit too much contrast. There's too much black going on. So we're going to switch that to a brighter color. We're going to put the value to a 0.5 so that it's more blendy. And then next, all we're going to do is blend these together. So we'll hit Shift A, search for a mix RGB. I'll press enter. Then we're going to be moving this color right here into this mix node. And if we Control Shift left click to preview, we can sort of see what's going on. And next we'll be taking the color from the first color ramp and moving it into the factor of this. Then we're going to take this black and move it all the way down. So sort of what this is saying is that it's mixing these by this factor essentially. So this is taking effect everywhere where the white stuff is, basically. Just adding in some nice bump essentially is what this is doing. And if you want, or I recommend going and checking clamp on this just to be safe. Next, this is going to factor into the bump of the mesh. So we'll hit Shift A, search for a bump node right here. Take this color, put it into the height, and we'll be switching the strength all the way down to a 2, not to a 2, that'd be higher, to 2.9-ish. I use a 2.92 in the final product, and so that is what I'll be using here as well. So if we look at the bump node, we can see what it's looking like, just so you can tell. Currently, this is a bit strong, and we'll be messing with it a little bit later, and there's going to be other bumps factoring into things, so it'll end up looking fine in the end, because it's a little bit pointy right now, to be honest, but it'll be fine once we've added everything else. So now we've added in some of the bump, we're going to be switching over to some roughness stuff now. So we'll hit Shift A, search for a mix RGB, like so. Go ahead and check clamp on it, because why not? Control plus Shift left click to preview. And we're going to be putting this color into our factor. Then we're going to take the color from this bottom guy, and we're going to put it into color 1, and the color from the mix RGB, and we'll put it into color 2, like this. So this is sort of what our bump is looking like as of right now. And if you can tell, for some reason on the seams, it is wider than the rest, and that is because it is rougher. And in color node and black and white data, at least, this is reading the wider stuff as rougher, which is what we want. We don't want it to be super shiny on the inside. So the next step is going to be plugging this into the roughness. And if we Control Shift left click to preview, something that we'll notice when it loads is it's a little bit too shiny for rocks, if you ask me. Like, even though the material is all white right now, let me darken this a little bit so we can tell. It is a bit too shiny. So to fix that, we're going to hit Shift A, add in a bright contrast node, put it right here. And we're going to be switching the brightness, and we're going to be moving it up a bit. Something like a 0.35 should about do it. So now it's slightly shinier in some places, but not quite. And if we Control Shift left click to preview the brightness contrast, we can see that it's a little bit too one-dimensional. So we can lower this a little bit, maybe to like a 0.17, something like that. Now we can preview the final, and we can see that it's pretty rough, but there are some spots that sort of shine a little bit like you'd see in a normal rock. So we'll just leave the brightness at a 0.2, and then we'll be set there. So the next step is going to be adding in the color stuff, essentially. So the first step to doing the color is we're going to create a mask, basically where we want dirt to be on the cobblestone. It's not going to be a lot of dirt, it's just going to be very subtle, but we're going to be creating a mask for that. So we're going to add in a noise texture, plug the vector into the noise texture, press Shift A and add a color ramp, plug the factor from the noise texture into the color ramp. Then on this noise texture, we're going to be switching the scale to a 5.22. And if we Control Shift left click to preview, we can see what's going on. So the scale is a 5.22. It can be like a 5.2. You can just fiddle around with it. It doesn't have to be perfect. The detail we're going to leave on a 2 is going to be not very detailed at all. Roughness, we're going to move up to a 0.6. And then on this color ramp, we're going to be bringing in these values a bit. The white will bring down to something close to a 0.4, a little bit higher than a 0.4 though. 4.14. I mean 0.414 is fine. And then the black, we're going to be bringing up slightly. Nothing too much, just something a little above a 0.1. 0.118 is okay. This is just adding in where we want our dirt to be. So next step is going to be adding in the actual colors so that we can use this mask to begin with. So we're going to be pressing Shift A, searching for another noise texture. This is going to be the color of the rocks, and then after that will be the color of the dirt. So if you notice that the workspace is getting kind of cramped, you can go ahead and grab these and move them down a little bit, or grab these and move them up slightly to give yourself some more room. Then we're going to want to make sure we have the noise texture plugged into the vector. And a cool trick you can do is you can hold Shift and right click and drag over here, and then you get an extra node that you can play with and move around, and then you're still dragging in the node from the mapping, just to keep your workspace a little more organized. So if we Control Shift left click to preview this noise texture, we can, and then we're going to switch the values on here. This one's going to be close to like a 15. I use a 14.8. The detail, we're going to move up to a 15, and the roughness to about a 0.6. I'm going to use a 0.59. You can fiddle around with it until you like the contrast going on here. So now, to give it color, we're going to search for a color ramp and change these colors to some grayish blues. So On this one, the white, we're gonna go ahead and drag it in a bit to about a 0.7, just so that when we have some more contrast in the color. So on the first color, we're gonna be switching the black to something like a 0.35 on the value scale, something around there. Then the saturation will move up to something like a 1.3. We don't want anything too saturated because it is rock, so it's going to be sort of gray. 0.135 is good enough on the saturation. Then the hue is going to be something towards a blue, so we're going to want to use like a 0.6 or something like that. Something towards the blue on there. So that's a pretty good color. And then the white is sort of throwing everything off right now, so you can't really see the grayish blue coming out from the other one. So we're going to be switching that as well. The value on this one, we're going to switch all the way down to a 0.04 or 0.05, something in between those two. Let's do it as 0.045 just for the sake of it. And then the saturation will move to something like a 1.9-ish, or 0.19. A 1.9 would be non-existent, but 0.194 is pretty decent. And the hue, currently we're in a red and it's not looking too good. So we need to move the hue all the way to a blue, something like a 0.65-ish, something around there. And now we have our color for our cobblestone. So now we need a color for the dirt, and so that we can then mix everything together properly. So we'll hit Shift A, search for another noise texture. Then we're going to take the color right here and plug it into our vector. And this is going to be rock mixed with dirt. It's not, I mean, it's going to be mortar mixed with dirt, basically. It's not going to be just dirt. So we're going to search for our color ramp and plug in the factor to the factor, like so. Then we're going to be switching the scale to a 10. And let's go ahead and preview this guy with Control Shift and left click. We'll move the detail to a 15 and the roughness to a 0.725. So sort of, it kind of is a grainy, blurry effect going on here. And that is what we want. So next we're going to be hitting the plus sign and adding in a third node. We'll just move that somewhere over there for now. Then we're going to take this black and we're going to drag it all the way up to something close to a 0.4. Something about here is good. And then the color on this guy is going to be our dirt. When we do that, is going to be our dirt, essentially. The color on this black will be the dirt, but we need a little bit more contrast because we don't want there to be too much dirt. As you can see, there's too much black going on in our mask, so we're going to be dragging this guy up a bit. Something close to like a 0.45, something like that. 0.68 looks pretty decent. So yeah, anyways, step 2 is going to be giving ourselves the colors. So this brown, like I said, is going to be our dirt. We're going to be switching the value on this guy to something slightly higher than a 0, but something like a 0.025, something around there. The saturation, close to like a 0.8, 0.82, 0.83, something like that. Sort of like a brownish color. And then the hue, we're going to be switching that to a 0.029 is what I use in the final one, but you can get something close to that. I probably won't use the exact value here. But yeah, essentially, we want a brown. These are the exact values I used right here on my screen if you want to copy them precisely. Next, we're going to be taking this white right here, and we're going to be switching this color into something more close to a mortar, which would be holding the cobblestone sort of together, which means we're going to be switching the value down quite a bit, like a 0.015, something very dark gray. 0.016 is good enough. Saturation, something close to like a 0.13, something around there. And the hue will be sort of like a 0.02, something like that. So we get a sort of reddish gray for those little bits right there. And it'll blend better once we switch this white. And on this white, we're literally be switching it to a pure black. So this is just adding some flavor into our color. It's not going to be a predominant color. The predominant color is going to be this, and this will just be adding in some flavor here and there. So to add that, we're going to be adding in some mixed RGB nodes. So let's Shift A, search for a mixed RGB right here. So now we're going to take the color from the rocky one, plug it into color 2, color from the dirt and plug it into color 1, Control Shift left click, and we can sort of see what's going on. But essentially what we need to do is we need a factor. And for this factor, we're going to be taking the color from the original color ramp, the first one we ever did, from the Voronoi texture, and plug it into the factor here. So we can sort of see the color starting to do its thing. It's still slightly wonky, so we're going to be making another slight change. which is what this mask up here is for. So we'll hit Shift A, search for another mixed RGB like this. Then we're going to take the factor from this one, or the color from this one, and plug it into the factor. We can preview, Control Shift left click. Make sure you go ahead and hit clamp on your color, on your mixed RGBs as well. Then we'll take the dirt color and plug it into color 1. And we'll take the last mixed RGB and plug it into color 2. So now we have our cobblestone color, and it's looking pretty much like rock or cobblestone. Obviously, you can play with the colors of your rocks a little bit. Say you want to do something deserty, you could go with something more grainy and sandy colors, but we're going to be using rocks for this tutorial. Then all you have to do is take this color and plug it into the base color. Now we're going to be adding another bump component with some of those nodes we just made. So we'll just Shift A, search for a bump node right down here. I'll plug it in after this guy, because why not? On this, we're going to be switching the strength to a 0.2, and the height for this one is going to come from this color ramp right here, the stone color ramp. We'll plug that into the height. So if we Control Shift and left click, we can sort of see what's going on. And it's just adding in some bump where the color was to make it look more rocky. If it's a 1, obviously it's too much, which is why we lowered it to a 0.2. So then we can take the normal from this previous bump and plug it into the normal of this bump. And now we sort of have a mix going on. This one is still pretty strong, so we might lower a little bit, but there's still one more bump factor that we're going to be mixing in. Then we can determine what needs to be lowered and what shouldn't be. And that bump factor was what we'll do right now, because it's about the last thing we need to do. And to do that, we'll just hit Shift A, search for a bump node. Then from this original color ramp, the one in the middle right here, we're going to take this color and factor it into our height. If we Control Shift left click to preview, we can see that it's simply just making the mortar lower than the rest. Obviously, this is a bit too strong. Let's try something closer to like a 0.5, and that makes it a little bit better. And so yeah, so let's plug this normal into this bump, and it'll give us a preview of what's going on. And as you can see, that alone sort of flattened things out a bit. It's still slightly too strong in my opinion, so let's go ahead into this first bump. So just like a 0.2 instead. And now it's a bit flatter, and I think that looks a lot nicer because the edges aren't so sharp. You can still see some of them here and there, but it's all right. It is rock. If we Control Shift left click to preview this, we can see what the color and the roughness look like on their own. Then when we factor in this normal right here, plug the normal into the normal, then we get this going on right here. And we have some, the rock is a little bit shiny depending on the look you're going for. So you can always up this on the brightness to like a 0.3, and it gets a little bit rougher and the light sort of scatters out more. But essentially this is what the material looks like in Eevee, and it looks pretty decent. It's not too bumpy or anything. It looks a little bit too smooth to be photorealistic or anything, but it works really well for a game texture, or if you're doing some sort of animation, it works really well in the background. Or I'm using it for a wizard tower. I'm actually using the Cycles version for it, but I'm also going to make an Eevee render. And yeah, I'm using the cobblestone in that sort of environment in Eevee and Cycles. Now, as promised, I'll show you how to make the Cycles one, and that's just by adding a couple nodes. So we have to add 2 mixed RGBs and then a displacement node, and then we're set for the Cycles version. So let's Shift A, add these 2 mixed RGB nodes. We're going to switch both of these guys to clamp and to multiply, and 1 on each of them. Then what we're going to do is we're simply going to take the color, the black and white data, essentially the color that's plugging into each of the heights, and plug it into the colors of here. So we took this one because we're plugging this height, and then we need what's plugging into this height is the color up here. So we'll take that, move it into color 2, and we Control Shift left click to preview. It's just multiplying them all together basically. So yeah, then we can take this color, plug it into color 2, and then who's plugging into this guy? We haven't done him yet. This guy is, take him, plug him into color 1. Then we Control Shift left click over here, and we can see what's going on. This is our new black and white displacement map. So to factor that into the material output, we are going to have to be in Cycles to be able to see anything happening. So if we go over here to render settings, switch over to Cycles, and then you'll have to switch over to experimental as well. Then if you press N on your keyboard, you can open up this right here, your toolbar, or not, this isn't your toolbar, is it? I don't know what this is actually called, this panel. Then you go over here to options, settings, and then this displacement only right here. You need to switch from bump only to displacement and bump, and then we'll be fine to go from there. Next, all you need to do is hit Shift A, add in a displacement node right here, plug in this color into the height. Make sure you don't plug it into the normal, plug the color into the height because this is black and white data. Then you can take that and you can plug this into the displacement of this. And once we are plugged in and we're at a 1 to scale, make sure you Control-Shift left-click your principled BSDF again so you can see what's going on here. So as you can see, this mesh is obviously getting displaced way too much. So we need to switch the scale on this to something like 8.1. And if you'll notice, it's still smaller than it should be. It's not sticking out anywhere. And what you might ask, why is that? And that's because this is super dark. And when we go to the displacement map, it's saying, oh, everything needs to be lower than it originally was. And that isn't really what we want. We want the rocks to be kind of sticking out a bit. So if we hit Shift A, search for a color ramp, like so, plug it in right here, and then we can drop this down and press flip color ramp on this drop down. It flips what is going on, essentially. I mean, that's exactly what we just did. But yeah, we can Shift left to preview the color ramp. It looks almost like a pure white. It isn't, it just looks like that to our eyes. And to tell that, if we switch this back to a 1 on the scale, we can see everything protruding and the displacement is actually happening on the mesh. And then you can play around with the scale of this, something like a 0.5 maybe, and then you can see how it's protruding in different areas properly and everything like that. So, and if we drag this black in a bit, we can see that on the curve, we control left click to preview the color ramp again. The more we drag in the black, the more deformed it gets, essentially. Like you can see it really making an effect there. But yeah, you can drag in the black quite a bit to get some better effects. Depending on how bumpy you want your cobblestone to be, this obviously is way too much displacement going on when you drag in the black this much, but you can play with that and get it how you like. But the point is, it's actually displacing the mesh versus just faking everything. So you can play with that how you want. I'm going to be leaving it the black somewhere, I don't know, like a 0.5, 0.6, somewhere around there. And this is a material I'll actually be using. I kind of like how bumpy it is. I'm using it for more of a rustic kind of a look, so less smooth is good for me. But anyways, that's how you make the cycles version. Sorry if that was a bit confusing. Obviously, this node tree is a bit unorganized, and I should probably organize things better in the future. But yeah, anyways, hopefully you enjoyed this material and we can be able to use either the cycles or Eevee version in one of your projects. And so yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.